To understand the genius of Jane Austen, we often look to the polished, razor-sharp social commentary of Pride and Prejudice or Emma. But before she was the master of the English novel, she was a 14-year-old girl with a notebook and a very sharp sense of how ridiculous certain books could be. That notebook contained Love and Freindship, a title that famously includes a misspelling which tells you everything you need to know about its tone. This isn't a serious novel. It's a parody, a collection of sketches written to mock the cult of sensibility, a literary trend of the late 18th century that obsessed over characters who were so deeply, irrationally emotional that they were practically incapable of functioning in society. The story is presented as a series of letters written by an elderly Laura to a friend's daughter, Marianne. Laura is looking back on a life that was, by her own account, a whirlwind of high-stakes melodrama and catastrophic emotion. We meet Laura and her friend Sophia in their youth. They aren't just young women, they are exalted souls, living in a state of constant, high-pitched feeling. They are part of a group of lovers who believe that following their hearts is the only thing that matters, even if it means defying every social and financial norm of the era. Laura falls in love with Edward, a man who defies his father, Sir Edward, to marry for love rather than for a strategic alliance. The two of them marry and flee to seek refuge with Sophia and her lover, Augustus. This group represents the ultimate romantic ideal, a circle of lovers living entirely for passion, unburdened by the vulgar concerns of money or reputation. But, as Austen quickly shows us, when you live entirely for passion, the reality of the world tends to catch up with you very quickly. The romantic fantasy begins to crumble as the practical consequences of their choices set in. Augustus, in a desperate attempt to fund their lifestyle, turns to theft, and the group's financial stability vanishes. The narrative moves with a frantic, almost chaotic energy. There is a sudden windfall from a long-lost relative, Lord St. Clair, which provides a brief moment of hope, but it's quickly overshadowed by more drama. The climax of this first section is a masterclass in parodying the tragic death scenes common in the sentimental novels of Austen's time. A carriage accident leaves Edward and Augustus bloodied and broken. In a scene that is both heartbreaking and utterly absurd, Edward dies in Laura's arms. Then, there is Sophia. Sophia, who has spent her entire life being sensitive to every slight and every emotion, dies not from the accident itself, but from a fainting fit. It is the ultimate punchline to the cult of sensibility. She was so delicate, so emotionally overwhelmed by the tragedy, that her body simply gave up. Laura is left alone, descending into a state of raving madness and melancholy solitude in the Scottish Highlands. It is a heavy, dark, and highly stylized ending, and it serves as a warning about the dangers of living life as if you were a character in a tragedy. But then, the book does something quite strange. It shifts. The melodrama of Laura's life gives way to a second, unfinished story titled Leslie Castle. This second part moves away from the high-pitched weeping of the first part and moves towards something more grounded, though no less satirical. Here, the focus shifts to the Lutterell and Leslie families. We see the anxieties of the landed gentry, the people who owned the land, and the social status that came with it. The Lutterell family is struck by a sudden death when Henry dies in a horse accident, leaving his fiancée, Eloisa, in a state of permanent, grief-stricken invalidism. Meanwhile, the Leslie family is facing financial ruin because Sir George Leslie wants to remarry, and his new wife is a socialite with extravagant, expensive tastes. In this section, Austen's wit becomes more focused on social performance. The characters don't just feel things, they perform them. They use language and social rituals to signal their status or to manipulate those around them. We see the introduction of Lady Susan, a character who would become a recurring figure in Austen's later works. She is a woman who uses her wit and her social standing to navigate the world with a certain cold, calculating grace. We see the social divide in action during encounters with people like Lady Greville, where condescension is used as a tool to maintain class boundaries. The narrative becomes increasingly fragmented and satirical. In London, we meet Margaret Leslie, who falls into a sudden, obsessive infatuation with a man she has never actually spoken to. It's a brilliant jab at the way young women of the time were taught to fall in love with the idea of a person rather than the person themselves. Austen even breaks the flow of the story to include a history of England, which uses historical figures to mock the political and religious prejudices of her own time. The book is essentially telling us that the grand narratives people tell about history and society are often just as performative and biased as the romantic novels she is mocking. As we approach the end of the work, the tone shifts again. We are introduced to the correspondence of Thomas Musgrove and Henrietta Holton. If the first part of the book was a parody of tragedy, this part is a parody of the language of courtship. Thomas and Henrietta exchange letters filled with hyperbolic, theatrical declarations of love and suicidal despair. They speak in a way that is almost unrecognizable as human communication. It is a stylized, performative version of romance that borders on the ridiculous. The resolution of their subplot is surprisingly grounded compared to the rest of the book. Lady Scudamore reveals Henrietta's secret affection for Tom, and they agree to wait until Henrietta has more financial independence before they marry. It is a rare moment of practical, sensible resolution in a book that has spent its time mocking everything that is impractical and overly sentimental. But the book doesn't end with a traditional conclusion. Instead, it dissolves into a series of disconnected literary sketches, a female philosopher, and a surreal travelogue. It doesn't try to tie everything up in a neat bow because, for Austen, there was no point in doing so. The book itself is a collection of mocks, a series of different ways that people try to perform their lives through literature and social ritual. When we step back and look at Love and Freindship, we see the blueprint for the great novelist Austen would become. Even at 14, she understood a fundamental truth about human nature. We are all, to some extent, performers. We perform our grief, we perform our love, and we perform our social status. The cult of sensibility was a way for people to signal that they were good and deep by being as emotional as possible. Austen saw through this. She saw that when you prioritize the display of emotion over the reality of character, you end up with characters like Laura and Sophia, people who are so lost in their own internal drama that they cannot survive the real world. She also highlights the tension between the ideal of romantic love and the cold, hard reality of economics. In the first half, the characters' refusal to care about money leads to death and madness. In the second half, the characters' obsession with social status and inheritance dictates every move they make. Austen suggests that both extremes, the total disregard for reality and the total obsession with social rules, are forms of performance that prevent people from actually living. Love and Freindship is a fascinating, messy, and often hilarious look at a young writer finding her voice. It shows us that Austen's famous social irony didn't come from nowhere. It was born from a desire to laugh at the absurdity of the stories we tell ourselves about love and life. She wasn't just mocking the books she read, she was mocking the very idea that life could ever be as simple, as dramatic, or as easy as a sentimental novel suggests. In the end, the book leaves us with the realization that the most important thing isn't how loudly we weep or how grandly we declare our love, but the quiet, unperformative reality of how we actually treat one another.